La Royale. That is the name given to the French Navy, which is officially known as the Marine Nationale, or National Navy. It's an ironic name, the Royal, given that the French abolished their monarchy back in 1789. Nevertheless, France's navy dates back to 1624, making it one of the world's oldest. The motto of the French Navy is Honneur, Patrie, Valeur, Discipline, or Honneur, Fatherland, Valeur, Discipline. Those words are inscribed on the deck of every ship in the French fleet. However, what happened to that proud French naval tradition during World War II? Let's just say it was a conflicted navy, collaboration, an attack by a former ally, the self-inflicted scuttling of many ships. The story of the French Navy in the Second World War had it all, and more. La Marine Française, or French Navy, was not in formidable shape by the late 1930s. Her fleet, although still very professional and of a high standard, had been severely depleted due to the terms of the 1922 Treaty of Washington in the aftermath of the First World War. Her navy was certainly nowhere on the scale of the navies of Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. Nevertheless, France still had a large global empire at that time, second only to the British Empire, for which her navy did most of the defending. As such, her fleet only had a small presence at its base in Brest, on the country's Atlantic coast, with the rest being stationed in far-flung colonies in the Pacific Ocean, the Caribbean, and Africa. But by 1940, just months after the outbreak of the Second World War, France had concentrated more of her fleet in the Mediterranean. This was to act as a countermeasure to the large presence of the Italian Navy, or Regia Marina, which by that time was far larger than France's navy. The French and Italians were not at war with one another since Italy was officially neutral until June 1940, but the French were very weary of the Italian presence near North Africa, in such close proximity to France's own possessions in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. The French Navy remained fairly inactive in early 1940. French patrols had the principal duty of protecting French embarkation ports, particularly those at Nantes and Saint-Nazaire on the Bay of Biscay. The British had been sending naval units to France from September 1939 because both countries knew that Germany might attack France at any time. While the French Navy suffered no losses in that period, the French merchant navy wasn't so fortunate. By May 1, 1940, 16 merchant French ships had been sunk by German U-boats in the Atlantic, totaling 74,648 tons. It was far less than what the British merchant navy had suffered in the same period, but, comparatively speaking, French vessels were more likely to get hit, mostly because they were not as well defended as British merchant ships were in their convoys. Although the French knew that the Germans would probably invade, the Nazi invasion on May 10, 1940, was still a huge shock for France. One could say that the fall of France, as it was heralded, was a turning point for the Allies. It took just 6 weeks for Germany to overpower France, after seize the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. It was final proof of what lengths Hitler was willing to go in order to control Western Europe. France, humiliated and soundly beaten, signed an armistice with Hitler on June 22, 1940. The armistice meant that France was divided into two zones, one occupied by the Germans, with the other designated as a zone libre, or free zone, under the control of the new French government, which was based in the small spa town of Vichy in central France. Officially, both zones were under the control of the Vichy government, but in reality it was the Nazis who dictated. A government in exile known as France Libre, or Free France, was set up in London under General Charles de Gaulle. The collapse of France's Third Republic and the establishment of the puppet Vichy government would mark a dark chapter in modern French history. It was seen as an epic sellout to the Germans, the very worst of collaborating with the enemy. Collaboration became a word that scarred the French psyche during the war and for years thereafter. Of all France's armed forces, it was the navy that was quickest to collaborate with the Germans. The French navy was traditionally conservative and felt a kinship to the ultra-right-wing German regime. The armistice had stipulated that the French navy would be mostly disarmed and confined to French harbors, even as the French navy cooperated with the Germans. The Allies, and in particular the British, were very unhappy with this situation. The Allies had just lost France and the Low Countries to Germany, not to mention the humiliation of the retreat from Dunkirk. The ascendancy was definitely with Hitler. Something had to be done, something dramatic. And the newly appointed Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, had just the plan. The British knew they had to somehow neutralize Vichy France's naval capacity in North Africa. That would mean securing the all-important shipping lanes in the Mediterranean used by British merchant ships. The plan, which was codenamed Operation Catapult, was to attack Mers-el-Kébir, a French naval base near the city of Oran on the Mediterranean coast of what was then French Algeria. This was never going to be easy for the British. First, the French had a strong presence in North Africa. Second, one needs to remember that until just 10 days earlier, the British and French had been strong allies. Now the British were poised to take out French ships and with them kill French sailors. Admiral James Somerville and his H-Force were the ones tasked by Churchill to conduct Operation Catapult. It was therefore Somerset who had to communicate with his French counterpart, Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul. The British wanted to give the French the chance to give up their ships to the Allies in a peaceful manner so as to avoid being bombarded by British planes. After all, they were traditional allies. And so Admiral Somerville sent the following cable to Admiral Gensoul on July 2, 1940, which read, "It is impossible for us, your comrades up to now, to allow your fine ships to fall into the power of the German or Italian enemy. We are determined to fight on until the end, and if we win, as we think we shall never forget that France was our ally, that our interests are the same as hers, and that our common enemy is Germany. For this purpose, we must make sure that the best ships of the French Navy are not used against us by the common foe." Somerville continued by saying he'd been instructed by his government to neutralize the French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir near Oran. To achieve that end, the British proposed one of three options to the French, namely, 1. That the French sail with the British and fight against Germany and Italy, or 2. Sail with reduced crews under British control to a British port. Those crews would be repatriated back to France when the war was over, as would all French ships, or 3. Sail all French ships with reduced crews to a French port in the West Indies, with the island of Martinique being given as an example. Once there, they could be demilitarized by the British or Americans until the end of war, after which all French troops and ships would also be repatriated. Somerville concluded his cable with, "If you refuse these fair offers, I must, with profound regret, require you to sink your ships within 6 hours." Of course, there wasn't a chance in hell that the French were going to accept those terms. Their German occupiers would never allow it, and in any case, the French Navy was decidedly pro-German. The French admiral never did respond, and so it all went down the next day, on July 3, 1940. The British bombardment of Mers-el-Kébir was fast and brutal. It resulted in 1,297 French servicemen losing their lives, as well as the sinking of a battleship, the Bretagne, with all of its 977 crew lost. There was damage to 5 other ships, including the battleship Dunkirk, the destroyer Mogador, which was badly damaged, and another destroyer, the Provence, which ran aground. The French Navy hadn't been wiped out, but it was still a devastating attack that left it mostly impotent. The La Royale of Vichy would never recover. By the end of 1942, the Vichy regime had lost nearly all of its already limited autonomy. German and Italian forces had taken over most of southern France as a bulwark against Allied advances in North Africa, thus rendering the Vichy government as useless. In the meantime, The Allies were on the verge of attacking southern France. The Vichy government didn't want the Allies to get their hands on French ships. Neither did they want the Germans to do so, by the way. The French knew that Hitler wanted to seize their ships and give them to the Italians. De Gaulle tried to convince the Vichy government to send their ships over to the Allies, but Vichy was not interested. And so the Vichy command decided to scuttle all their ships in the harbor of Toulon on France's Mediterranean southern coast. The result was the self-destruction of, or major damage to, 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, 12 submarines, 15 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 6 sloops, 9 patrol boats, 19 auxiliary ships, 1 school ship, and 28 tugs. Some of the larger ships were on fire for several days, resulting in the harbor being so badly polluted that no one could swim in the water for 2 years. We must turn our attention now to the Free French Navy. The Navy of the Free France government in exile, known as the Forces Navales Françaises Libres, or FNFL, was commanded by Admiral Émile Muselier. It formed part of the Free French Forces, or Forces Françaises Libres, or FFL. Charles de Gaulle had made a plea on June 24th for all French servicemen overseas to join the FFL. 2 days later, the French submarine Narval entered the British-owned island of Malta and pledged its allegiance to the newly formed FNFL. Vice Admiral Muselier had joined de Gaulle in London on June 30th, coming in from Gibraltar by flying boat. Muselier would be the only senior-ranking officer of the French Navy that rallied to the side of de Gaulle and Free France. A number of French vessels in British waters had been seized by the British as a prelude to Operation Catapult, as were the French ships docked in the English ports of Plymouth and Portsmouth. Seized ships included 2 obsolete battleships, the Perry and Courbet, the destroyers Le Triomphant and Léopard, 5 submarines, 8 torpedo boats, and a number of other smaller vessels. In total, 3,600 French sailors operating 50 ships worldwide escaped to be a part of the Free French Navy and joined up with the Royal Navy to fight on the side of the Allies. Several French merchant ships also joined the FNFL fleet. However, the crew of the French submarine, Surcouf, which at the time was the largest sub in the world, had resisted British seizure, resulting in the death of 2 British officers and 1 French sailor. Another vessel, the Béarn, was France's only aircraft carrier and was on its way back from the United States when Germany invaded France. It was loaded with American-made fighter and bomber aircraft. However, that crew was unwilling to either return to occupied France or side with de Gaulle and the FNFL, so it diverted to the French island of Martinique, where it sat doing nothing for 4 years, the aircraft on board rusting away in the tropical heat. The FNFL was still desperately short of vessels, and so some were leased from the Royal Navy. One of the first things de Gaulle did to boost his Free French Navy was to sail with some British ships and FNFL men to Dakar in Senegal. He needed to rally support for the Free France cause among the French colonies. In fact, most sub-Saharan African colonies were supportive of de Gaulle, including Chad and Mali. However, the Vichy government sent a cruiser and claimed victory at the Battle of Dakar, which was basically a war between 2 French navies. It is very well known that the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, or D-Day as the landings themselves would be commonly known, was a turning point in the war. What is less well known is that the Free French, in the form of the FNFL, played a prominent role on the side of the landing Allied forces. The FNFL took part in the naval operation, known as Operation Neptune, as well as the actual landings on D-Day, including 2 cruisers, 2 frigates, and a corvette at Omaha Beach, a frigate, a corvette, and a torpedo boat at Juno Beach, 2 corvettes at Utah Beach, and 1 corvette at Gold Beach. Just off the Normandy coast, the French cruisers Georges Laigle and Montcalm assisted the American battleship, the USS Arkansas, in providing fire support for the infantry on the beaches and beyond until June 10. The British Hunt-class destroyer La Combattante which had been handed over to the FNFL in 1942, also played its role. It engaged in fire with German coastal artillery battalions and patrolled the English Channel. She would go on to ferry General Charles de Gaulle to France on July 14, France's Bastille Day. The Vichy government finally collapsed in September 1944. De Gaulle would become president, but France would be a deeply divided and scarred country by the end of the war. Collaboration with the Nazis and fighting with the Allies had taken their toll. The French Navy was divided, pillaged, and ravaged. In the end, La Royale had survived a unique, tumultuous time in its long history.